Okay, good afternoon. My name is Joachim Hammer. Welcome to Build and welcome to our session on securing your data with Azure SQL Database. I'm here alongside two colleagues, or one colleague, Jakub Szymaszek, and a partner, Richard Kaskell from Redgate. Richard wasn't on the original program, if you're a little surprised. So this was a decision that we made afterwards. And you probably know, SQL, Redgate, we have a historical collaboration that spans many, many years in releases. And recently we're collaborating with Redgate on some of the security things. So we thought it might be a great idea to have Richard and Redgate come and show some of the stuff that they've been working on. So hence the addition to the program here. As to what we're talking about this afternoon, it's mostly focusing on what's new, and new is a little bit is relative. So there's some stuff there that's still in preview. There's a few things that are GA'd. It's a little bit of a mixture, but it should give you an overview again of the direction we're going, what's new, what's coming, and then we'll close off with a little bit of a roadmap. So that's the plan. And again, as always, the session we're doing these sessions very informal. Feel free to come up into the microphone, please, if you would, and ask questions anytime, and we'll entertain them right then and there. So this is, you may have seen the slide in different variations. The bucket names may change, and this is not the latest still. We're always tweaking the names of these buckets, but the point here is Azure SQL DB and the Azure SQL services have a number of features and capabilities that are aimed at helping you keep your data secure and private and meet compliance requirements. And so we're trying to give you an overview of what's there and how you might think about some of these features to then help you devise a strategy. And so the ones that are colored in green are the focus of today. And then we have a few features that you can see, for example, AAD authentication, threat detection. Those are features currently only in the cloud, available in the cloud, while AAD actually is cloud specific, so that's not something you'll find on-premise. So there's a little bit of a differentiation there in some cases, so keep that in mind as well. But overall, our goal has always been, and currently still is, to make sure that features show up both in the cloud and on-premise, security features, that is. So with that, before I go, I wanted to, as an icebreaker and also for informational reasons, we want to hear a little bit from you as to how are you using our features, what are you doing, and so this is currently top of mind for me at least. I'm hoping for my colleagues as well. So raise your hand if you're currently using Always Encrypted. Now, Always Encrypted is that security feature that we've been talking about for a while that allows you to keep data encrypted in use. Anybody here who is using that currently? That is in the cloud. Sorry, I should start with that, in Azure. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, how about on-premise? Anybody using Always Encrypted on-premise? Okay, I think one hand there, so just one or two people. And is that for testing and sort of playing around with it, or is that actually a real production system that you're using there? Production, okay, cool. So I notice Jakub is all eyes here, great. And we have some updates for you on Always Encrypted a little bit later today, so Jakub is going to talk about that. Azure Active Directory Authentication. This is one of those features we're spending a lot of time and effort on, and we're not seeing a whole lot of adoption yet. So can we get a hand signal? Who is looking at that or using it? Okay, great. That actually seems more promising than what our telemetry shows these days. We are trying to get away from SQL Auth, making it easier to use AD identities, and the whole experience should improve that way, but I think we still have some ways to go here possibly. So the next couple of features, The reason I'm bringing those up is because we're also looking at maybe extending them a little bit. So data masking is a hot topic again with GDPR, of course. And we have a feature called dynamic data masking that's available both on-prem and in the cloud. Anybody here in the room who's using that by any chance? Nobody. Will be. Okay, good. Now, dynamic data masking, as you may know, allows you to create a mask and protect data as it is being returned to the application at the end of query execution. So we mask the result set, but we don't touch the original data, the source data. There's another way to do data masking called static data masking. In that, with that feature, we actually protect the data at rest, the original data. In fact, we would make a copy of the database. The typical workflow is you copy the database, you protect your sensitive data. The protection is permanent, irrevocably, so you can't go back after you do the masking. Is there anybody here who thinks that might be a useful feature? Okay, great. A couple hands are going up. Again, in the context of GDPR, I assume, maybe, or DevOps scenarios? Protecting sensitive data. The gentleman there, sorry? HIPAA, perfect. DevOps, excellent, good. Great, so that's good news. One last question for you, and I promise that's the last one here. We have a feature called row-level security, which provides fine-grained access control, so you can create, again, policies in the engine that control access to individual rows in your table. There is a variation of this called label-based security, where you could actually use labels and label hierarchies to do the same, rather than having a policy that specifies characteristics of users or connections in the database. You could use a label hierarchy to say, well, this particular user can only use rows that are tagged with these kinds of labels. Is there anybody here who thinks label-based security might be useful or interesting? Good. Are you from the government by any chance, or? Sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay, good. Well, thank you for your feedback. So we're in the middle of planning again. We do this, sort of regularly, and this is good input for us. It's rare that we get in front of a big crowd like this, and so thank you for your feedback here. And if you have anything else, I forgot to put my email address here, but if you want to talk to us afterwards, or if you want to have our email addresses for communication, then we'll be happy to do that. All right, so let's switch gears and actually start talking about some real features. And I'm going to start with a feature called vulnerability assessment. And there's a reason why this feature is actually the first one in my list, is because we view this as a starting point for figuring out how to secure your database. I mentioned earlier, you need to take a look at our features and then devise a security strategy. Well, vulnerability assessment, I think, is that feature that sort of serves as creates an initial assessment and then serves as a starting point for you to build a strategy around for your databases in terms of, what are the configurations, what am I protecting against, is this privacy, compliance, and so forth. So we have this tool. It's currently in preview. And as I said, it basically allows you to initially assess the status of your database, and then once you do this, it'll then continuously track the configuration of this database to catch any kind of drift from a baseline that you can set. So you assess, create a baseline, you continue to monitor, and then this tool will tell you if there's any drift from this baseline. And this tool runs in both the portal, our Azure portal, as well as available in SSMS to work against your on-premise SQL Server databases. So it's in both worlds. I think the latest, I think you don't need the latest version of SSMS, but I think 17.4 right around there. And it's essentially, you think of it as a rules engine. And so our team has implemented a number of rules. These rules eventually will be extendable. They kind of mimic a lot of the current benchmarks that are out there, like CIS, for example, if somebody's familiar with CIS, Federal Benchmark for Security and Privacy. So these rules are similar to that. This entire feature came about from an internal assessment tool that we have that we run against our databases to ensure compliance of our Azure service. And so gives you visibility in terms of what's happening, helps you remediate, and then customize. Customize really means, as I said, you can create a baseline, craft those rules that you're interested in, and you can neglect those that fire where you say, okay, I'm okay with this, I'm okay with this violation. That's not as important to me. So there's a capability to set a baseline and then rerun the tool. I think rather than just talking about it, let me give a quick demo. And let me log in, and then I'll switch over. I think I'm on number 8. Okay, so not 8, maybe 7. Yes. Okay, so here we are in the Azure portal. And I've got a few things prepared. So let's take a look at this database here. This is Adventureworks. This is one of the sample databases that you can create if you provision a database. And then on this blade here, you'll see a number of features and capabilities. Not as well organized as we wish. There's some changes that are coming, so keep watching. In a couple of weeks or so, we'll have a better experience, especially around security. But right now, I'm going to choose vulnerability assessment. Here we go. And so this brings up the VA blade. And I ran the scan. I tested it a little bit earlier. So here's a scan already, just so that you know it's live. So we can click here and we can rescan it. Should take about a minute. And then what comes back is a list of rules that failed. Failed meaning they detected a vulnerability, and then some number of rules where the database passed. And what's nice here is, so in this case, I have 9 failing checks, and I have 39 passing. What's nice is now I can actually go and look at this dashboard, and one by one look at the rules that are failing. Let me just show you those that are passed. Very similar experience. And so I can go down this list now and figure out which of those checks really mean something to me and which ones do I want to ignore and maybe include in my baseline. And if you look over here, the rules are actually organized in terms of the perceived risk. So we group them. We took a stab at grouping them based on what we think are high-risk rules, like principles, for example. There should be a minimal set of principles that have high-impact permissions. For example, sensitive data columns should be classified, which is actually, a nice segue into, let me not look at this yet, nice segue into the next part that I'm talking about. But this particular rule here is a rule that's causing a lot of the other checks failing. Namely, I happen to have an empty role here in this database that has a lot of permissions attached to it, including execute permissions and so forth. And so the rules discover this, and not only do they tell you what's failing here, but they show you the query actually that's used in the rule to detect this. And even better, they have a mitigation here. So down here you said so it shows you in order to fix this, the recommendation is to drop this rule if you are so inclined. And there's even the syntax right here. So if I click on Run in Query Editor, it'll bring up an editor with the syntax, the T-SQL syntax, to drop that role. And And then just to go down here, I think somewhere there's threat detection is not enabled, and so forth. And let me show you a couple more interesting things are, so you can export these scan results. So you can run this, export the results, put them in a spreadsheet, look at them later. You can also go under settings, and this is relatively new now, where you can actually schedule these scans. So you remember, the idea is you initially run the scan, you get a sense of where your database, the configuration of your database, the vulnerabilities. You set the baseline, and then you can schedule and say, well, run the scan ever so often. And that requires a subscription, of course, a storage account here, which I already happen to have. And then I can turn this on and then provide an email address. And at that point, I will get notifications as to these scans. So I won't do that right here. There's, again, this is a first foray into this area. It's part of what we call advanced threat protection. There's a lot of enhancements that are coming. For example, the ability to run these scans at scale. This is something we hear quite frequently. That's coming. Also, the ability to expand these rules. So this feature, of course, is only as useful as the rules are sort of comprehensive and up to date. And in the future, we're even thinking of letting our users expand the rule set, bring their own rules, and so forth. We're lucky we have Ronit here at second row. She's the program manager for this feature. So if you have any questions for her afterwards, I'll direct all of the tough ones to her. Then you can talk to her firsthand. So, and then the other thing I didn't show you, you can, for example, this orphan role. So let's say, for example, this is something I created this role specifically. I understand the risk, but I'm okay with this. Last thing I could say, let's approve this as a baseline. And what that means is now this rule will not fail again on my subsequent checks, even though I have this empty role with all these permissions there. Cool. So that's vulnerability assessment. And let me quickly switch back for 1 second. One of the rules there that you saw was sensitive columns should be labeled. And they should be labeled because we want to make sure that we treat them properly. Well, that brings me to the next topic, namely, we have a new feature called data discovery and classification. And that's the tool that gets invoked from the VA tool to do exactly that, namely to classify sensitive data and then label it and then use that as a starting point for additional actions. Now, I think we all know why that's needed. So the reason you want to identify sensitive data and classify is because you want to make sure it's protected. And it's not such a big deal if you have like this Adventureworks database with 17 tables or maybe 20 tables or so. But if you have a large database with hundreds of tables, sensitive data can be anywhere. And so having a tool that actually does this automatically for you is critical. Again, we have GDPR, we talk to customers regularly about their DevOps scenarios. So there's a real need for making sure that I know where the sensitive data is. I can protect it, and I can protect sensitive or subsequent actions against that data. So this is where this tool comes in. And so as I said, we have a new preview feature called classification and discovery, which basically uses a bunch of info types. First of all, it looks at the metadata, the schema of your database, and then finds columns that could be considered sensitive. It classifies them against a known set of info types, and then it allows you to label them as, this is sensitive, this is general, this is super sensitive, and so forth. And we currently have a built-in set of info types in the label hierarchy. And in the future, we'll evolve this tool as well so that you can bring your own taxonomies and you can make changes to our info types and so forth. Again, this tool works both on-premise against your SQL Server databases as well as the cloud. Right now, they are a little different in the sense of, or in terms of where we store the label information. but that's going to get fixed in SQL Server vNext so that they are both on par. I think I mentioned most of it. Again, this is a starting point into an experience that we're shipping so that you can actually, so starting with the labeling, that's step one, and then actually using these labels to have perhaps policies that control what you can do with that data, who can do what with the data, or maybe making sure that access to sensitive data is audited. All of those experiences are getting rolled out later. And so stay tuned for many more updates that are coming here. So let me show you this as well. Just give you a quick glimpse. And I should have mentioned actually earlier, today in the session we're going to give you an overview of quite a few features with just a few teaser demos here and there. We have a workshop tomorrow, 3 hours or so, where we are going into much more detail on each of these topics. And so if you feel like I'm leaving you hanging here, it's a little bit on purpose because we're running out of time probably. And so if you want more information, please come to our workshop, 8:30 to 11 something tomorrow, and we'll have a lot more info there for you. So let me give you a quick teaser on this new feature here. I'm not going to save anything. So here we are. So this is the classification, the discovery and classification blade. And I'm on the same database again. And right now, I haven't done anything here yet. But if you notice, it has already. So I ran. So I have a recommendation up here already. So the tool already looked at this Adventureworks database, those 16, 17 tables. And it made a recommendation for what it thinks are sensitive columns. And so we can now take that route, or we can say, I'm ignoring this, and I'm going to do my own classification. So let's say what the tool suggests. So it found 18 columns across my schema where it thinks you have potentially some sensitive data. And you'll notice there is, it's across all the different tables, and you'll find things like mobile number, username, address. But you may also see things like Führerscheinnummer. So if you speak German, then that means it's a driver's license number. So the tool actually knows in a limited fashion. It understands different languages. I mentioned earlier we're using the metadata. So that's where that has to come in. So it's a little bit multilingual. And it basically does pattern matching against the columns and the labels. And it identifies those that typically contain sensitive data. So all of this is flagged, and it's matched it against the info types that are in the system here. So things like national ID, my mobile phone number is probably contact information, maybe username could be a credential here, names and so forth. And then it matches it against, or it attempts to assign a sensitivity label to it, so whether or not it's confidential or not. And so what you could do is here, I'm just going to accept all of this. And when I do, I get to this view, and I can still notice, I can still now go over here and say, well, okay, let me do some fine tuning here. So maybe, I don't know, maybe it's not confidential here, this tax amount, maybe that should be highly confidential. Or maybe the phone number is really not confidential in the sense, so maybe I'll just make it general. So I think you get the picture. You can just basically do a little bit of fine-tuning here. And then I always have to make sure that I save this, otherwise I'm looking at my demo and things are not working properly. So we can save this, and now what we have is, now we've classified our database. So we get a little visual here saying you have these types of info types and these types of labels. And based on this, we can now, in the future, figure out, well, okay, with this database, I have to make sure that my columns are treated appropriately. Now, there's one more thing that I want to show you. I have one more query that I want to run. And should have opened that earlier. Here it is. So this already ties in with auditing. So what we could do is, assuming that you have auditing turned on, and I didn't show you this, but here's a tab, Auditing and Threat Detection. And so I have auditing turned on. I have a storage account. Whoops, don't want to do that. So now what we can do, now that we have the database classified appropriately, what happens is if I actually run some queries, so there's some predefined queries here. Okay, let me run this again. So now what I do with these queries running against my classified database, I can actually go and look at my storage account, and I will see that, and this takes just but a minute, I will see in my storage account that access against these columns that are flagged as sensitive will actually show up in my audit records. So this is the first sort of integration that you see where having a labeled or a classified database will actually pay dividends down the road because we are already flagging those in the audit records. So it's a big table. I should have scaled it down, but these are, if you're familiar with auditing, these are these typical audit events that are coming back. But if you look all the way over here, these labels are, if you look at the last column to your right, these labels that we just created earlier or that we just attached to the database, they're actually flowing into audit now as well. Okay, I'm going to pause here because I want to invite Richard up on stage. Richard is from Redgate, and what Richard is going to show you is he's going to sort of pick up where I'm leaving off. Redgate and SQL have been collaborating on security, on building tools and experiences together. So Richard is going to show you a similar experience on-prem, I think, Richard, right? That's right. And that the important thing here is that Redgate actually uses our taxonomy, the same labels and info types that you saw. They're built into Redgate as well, so there's a lot of overlap. So if you wanted to classify your database and then use some Redgate tools to sort of build an experience on top of that. Okay, Richard?
Thanks, Yuki.
Sure.
Okay, so I'll just switch back to the slides for a moment. Number 5, I think. Okay, so I'm Richard McCaskill. I'm a product manager for Redgate Software. If you're not familiar with us, we've been building tools for the Microsoft Data Platform for about 18 years now. We're based out of the beautiful city of Cambridge in the UK. We have a couple of US offices as well. And in the past 5 or 6 years, we've really been specializing in database DevOps, in delivering tools to support build and test workflows for teams, software teams working with databases who want to bring the same sort of DevOps principles of iterations and speed and reliability and predictable behaviors to the workflows, including databases as well. And I'm here today because the SQL security team invited us up because we've also seen a tremendous upsurge in interest among our customers in build and test, in classifications, in protecting personal and sensitive data, and enhancing their workflows to automate those things. So that's Redgate. I'm going to take you through a scenario which is something we call provisioning for dev test. And this is the scenario where developers really want to have the most realistic and up-to-date data available so that they can exercise their code against realistic environments as early as possible in the pipeline. Now, that's challenging enough to deliver them in realistic environments because, of course, there's data that needs to be moved, there are changes that need to be made. At the very least, there are permission sets that need to be swapped out. It's also challenging to automate that process to make it repeatable and self-service, which is the ideal. But it's become even more challenging because database administrators, more than ever, are aware of the need to protect sensitive and personal data. There's the GDPR, of course, and we believe that's a clear direction of travel for regulation around the world, even if it doesn't affect your organization right now. There's increased awareness of data breach risk. We can't have missed the data breach epidemics, really, that are happening. And because they've got responsibility, well, organizations under GDPR now have organizational responsibility. They're under ever more scrutiny to be doing the right things, to not be exposing data unnecessarily, and not to be increasing the attack surface area. So I'm going to take you through a scenario where we're provisioning realistic data, production-like data, into lower environments in an automated manner for dev test. And just to reiterate, most organizations currently do copy down of data for dev test purposes. We got 72% on our survey, which you can get from our website. There's a state of database provisioning report that we did. I believe the Poppet Labs State of DevOps survey had about 80% for this number. It's a very, very common workflow. And in fact, even going back to Dave Farley and Jez Humble when they wrote Continuous Delivery based on their experiences at the LMAX exchange in London, they were doing copy down and reliably informed every night of production data into development. So it's got a long pedigree and it's very widely practiced. But we need to do more now. We need to automate this, but we also need to apply protection that's adequate. And we know that it's adequate, best of all, when we're working based on classifications, based on metadata, based on information that we've supplied, because we're recognizing, along with others, and especially our customers, that we do need some additional information to ensure the protections we apply are the right ones, because it's not cheap, it's not free to apply these protections. They require thought and effort, sometimes training. So in this workflow, we're going to take a production database, we're going to put it through our provisioning system. We're going to prepare that database for secondary use by replacing personal data with some generated data, generated or sample data. We're going to do some other operations like remapping permissions, which of course pretty much everyone ought to be doing in that workflow. Just a word on a little bit more context on how our DevOps dev test provisioning works. We are fundamentally using the virtualization built into Windows. We're using the VHD, VHDX format to create what we call an image, which is a copy of the data files, but which has undergone the adjustments that we need in order to make it safe to distribute. Once we've created that image, we can then mount clone databases and deliver those into the development workflows or into build processes, into CI, CD processes. So I'm just going to switch over here into my demo machine, number 6. Okay. And Joachim mentioned that we've got a similar. We've been working with the SQL security team. We've had calls to make sure that we don't go off at a tangent, that we're aligned on the taxonomy. What we've done initially, this is a preview feature. It's going to get a lot prettier. But at the moment, we're looking at several instances because most of our customers are working with quite a few instances and quite a few databases on those instances. So these are 6 instances here. I'm going to drill into one of them. And I can see there that, yep, Adventureworks again has some recommendations. This is a slightly different version of Adventureworks. I've got 39 recommendations on this one. So I'm going to look at those classifications. And very similar, you see the same taxonomy, you see the same recommendations. So I'm just going to apply those. Save those classification suggestions. And as we mentioned, it's completely interoperable with the Microsoft approach, and we aim to keep it that way. If I now look back at the databases, Adventureworks is no longer a priority, so it's dropped down. And I can see there that it has a set of classification labels applied and no longer has recommendations. I could, of course, go and add my own. So fine, so that's pretty much the same workflow. But the important thing to add is that what we're looking at here is our database provisioning system. If I just clear up my previous demo, this is a dashboard showing these DevOps prepared images. So these are ready to be used in DevOps workflows. They're all different sizes. Some of them have undergone modifications. I've got a bigger database there. There's a 3.5 terabyte one, which has 9 clone databases attached. Just for an example, if we look into those clone databases, there's a neat trick with virtualization that allows us to stand them up with a very small disk footprint. But what I'm going to do is, in my provisioning workflow, I'm going to create a new image. I'm going to take this from a SQL server, and I'm going to use that same instance that I performed the classifications on. In my case, my instance is called iClone1, and my database was Adventureworks 2012. Now, straight away, I've come up with a warning. So what's happened here is that our provisioning system has hit an API in order to tell us exactly what the labels are that have been applied through that classification, and to recommend an action. So in this case, it's recommending that I apply a masking set before creating the image. Now we've included a data masking product into our provisioning tool. We haven't got time to go into the details of exactly how you put together a masking set. You can come and talk to us at the booth in the expo hall if you're particularly interested in that. But for the moment, I'll just show you how you apply a masking set. So this does substitution, shuffling. It's a sophisticated static data masking tool. I've added that masking set to the operation that we're going to carry out. I've also got a T-SQL script. I'm just going to add that in as well. So my operation now is going to be to prepare a data image for distribution as a clone database into dev test workflows, but sanitized and virtualized. So I'm just going to kick that off. I need to store my image in a file share location. Effectively, this is just a virtual disk that's been prepared. And I'm going to give it a name. As you can see, I've done my demo before. So I'm going to call that 0508 and kick off that create image workflow. Now we can give you more details also at the booth about how that works. It's going to copy the database files fundamentally into a virtual disk. At this stage, it's running those modifications that we defined in the masking set. It'll also run that T-SQL script that just swaps out some permissions so that the other appropriate ones for the development environment that I'm going to deliver them into. But I know to do this because I've been prompted. I've been told that there are columns in this database that are sensitive and should be masked. There are obvious future options where, because we've got those info types, we've got a lot more context, we can do a lot more in the future about automating that masking process. Now, I did mention this is a DevOps workflow, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch quickly into PowerShell. Now, obviously, we don't have time to go into detail on a PowerShell script, but it's fully automatable. PowerShell is a first-class citizen in our provisioning system. And if I switch back, I can see those clone databases being delivered into developer workstations. That's how long it takes to stand up a clone database, regardless of the original size, because it's just mounting a virtual disk. And just very quickly, if we've got time, I'm going to have a look at some of the data changes that we made. So there's the original. There's Adventureworks 2012 on that server. And if I look down here, I can see those Adventureworks email addresses. That's something I wasn't entirely happy with, so I defined my masking set to replace those email addresses. And in the clone database, if I execute that same query, I'll see that I've got some generated email addresses in place of those originals. Of course, there's a lot of complexity in static data masking, and there's all sorts of, tokenization was mentioned. This is a very simple example of delivering a DevOps database with using the classification labels. So we've done a shift left workflow for database DevOps, but using classification labels that's aware of what we ought to be doing. Okay, I'll switch back to the slides. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Richard. So you'll see, you can expect more. This is just the beginning of a collaboration. We're still figuring out which directions to take it. But again, I think it's safe to say that there'll be more news coming in the future. Let's see. Okay, so there's some additional information. So I'm going to switch gears quickly and talk about a couple updates. One is on VNet service endpoints. It is not quite such hot news anymore. This has been G8 since beginning of the year now. I think the goal here is to give you a heads up that we are feeling your pain. We are working on VNet support for Azure SQL Database. And And the service endpoints are really just a first step in that direction. I think it's a good step, but we understand it's not going all the way yet. I think the best sort of way to look at it is look at the picture. What we have done now is we have enabled you to create endpoints, service endpoints for your Azure SQL Database servers. And that what allows you is to basically restrict access to these servers to your subnets only, which are in a VNet. So you can basically, as you can see up there, the internet connection is disabled. You can disable the being able to connect from the internet, and you can restrict the traffic to your VNet. So in this case, we have these two subnets. There's a front end and a back end. And in this case, your VNet rules are such that only the back end subnet there can connect to the logical database server shown on the right. What's missing still from this picture is to be able to actually take the entire server and move that into a VNet. This is something that we're working on currently, and I don't know the exact timeline, but I think later this year, perhaps early next year, is when we will have the full support there. I think the good news already here is, so none of this is something that you have to create yourself. So the service tunnel, this is all done underneath the covers. The experience is pretty straightforward. You create your service endpoint, and then for any given logical database server that you have, you just create a bunch of VNet rules that allow you to restrict the connectivity there. And finally, the traffic across from the subnet to your server, all of this remains on the Azure backbone. So I think that's an update for you. We are working on full VNet support. If you are looking at managed instance, on the other hand, and there's a bunch of sessions here this week, there the situation is already better. There we have support, VNet support. There's some architectural reasons why this is a little harder here, because SQL DB, after all, is a multi-tenant system. And so the implementation of VNets there is a little bit more complicated than in the case of managed instance, where you basically are the sole occupant of a tenant. So there's, you'll have access to the slides, and after each section, actually, in the slides, we have some additional links and information that you can peruse if you want to dive deep dive on the topic. Okay, we'll stay on access control for a little while still. Here, the update for those of you who use Azure Active Directory is that we are supporting multi-factor authentication now, which I think is good news, and I think we've seen some interest here as well. MFA is supported for a bunch of features, including SSMS and so forth. We'll show you on the right-hand side there, there's an update on sort of our rollout, which is gradually across the different tools. And if you have any questions, or if there's something that's not on the list, or for example, if you must have it for a command, SQL command or BCP, well, you can talk to Miek. He's sitting here in the front. He's our program manager for AAD MFA, and he may have some more details for you if you're specifically waiting on something there. I think what I do want to point out, so if you're using SSMS, you may have noticed there's a new authentication option in there. It's universal access, and this is basically our new interactive mode that supports MFA, and you don't need passwords anymore. So this is good news. I had a gentleman come to me and talk to me earlier about getting rid of passwords. Well, this is one way to do so. We do support both MSA and non-MSA accounts. So I'll give you a quick demo here in a few minutes. I'll use my Outlook account. And we support MSI as well. The way you control MFA is through conditional access in Azure Active Directory. There's a whole menu of options that you can set, including you can restrict access to only certain devices, certain clients, applications, and things like that. And the other good news is that you can configure this without having a domain administrator make any changes there. So let me show you quickly, and for that, Okay, so what I'll show you is I will connect to a server in Azure using SSMS. And oops. And so here is the new option, Active Directory Universal with MFA support. And so all I need to put in here is my username. And so this is an Outlook account. And so when I connect now, two things will happen. It'll ask me for my password. This is my Outlook password. And then the way I configured it with conditional access, I configured it to use to send me a code to my cell phone. So I get a text here in a second. So let's see how that goes. Okay. Okay, so, so here's the code, just came. Cool, and so now I'm connected. So here's, this is my server. And I don't think I have any databases in here, but that's not so important for this point. So again, the idea here is with MFA, you can now have two-factor authentication. It works for SSMS and a lot of the tools. We're rolling it out across all the drivers. And that should probably be, I don't know, by midsummer or so. So this is another tool in your toolbox for securing the authentication options against your servers and your databases. Okay, let me switch back. Again, there's a whole lot of detail here that I'm omitting, but if you come to the workshop tomorrow, Miek will walk you through the entire experience, starting from configuring your groups in AAD, configuring conditional access, setting up your administrators, adding users into groups, and all of that stuff. So I'm just scratching the surface here, but again, we have a little bit of a time constraint. So. And again here, there's some information that you can peruse. Okay, switching gears again, let's talk a little bit about encryption. There's a lot of things happening here. On the TDE aspect, we've gotten quite a few comments from you saying the service managed stuff is okay, but it's not working for us because either for compliance reasons, internal policies, and so forth, we need to be in control of the TDE protector, the asymmetric key that's used to basically encrypt and decrypt the database. So we listened, we knew that had to be done, and so the news here was that just a few weeks ago we finally GA'd this feature. It's known as TDE, or with BYOK. Essentially, it allows you to either create a key on-premise in an HSM and upload it into an Azure Key Vault, and then direct TDE to use that as the TDE protector, as we call it, or the asymmetric key that basically wraps and unwraps the encryption key, the DEC. Or you can use Azure Key Vault to create the key and then use that as a TDE protector. So both options are supported. And essentially, you have now control over the key itself, how often you want to rotate it, and things like that. It's the same encryption that we have before. The experience is both in the portal as well as with PowerShell. There are a few nuances and I'll show you a demo here, so let me quickly go over a few highlights here. One is just with on-premise TDE, now that you're in control of the key, there comes a lot of responsibility, namely if you lose that key, if for some reason the key is deleted, it's gone, the data is gone, there's nothing we can do. So calling us is not going to make any difference here. So you really have to take good care of this key. And so we put a bunch of safeguards in place after we've learned, or some customers learned the hard way during preview, that this is not to be taken lightly. So number one is When you create the Azure Key Vault now, temporarily you have to use Azure PowerShell because we require you to enable something called soft delete, which is basically a two-stage, think of it as two-stage delete. So we won't allow you to delete the key outright. We have the soft delete in there, which allows you basically to delete the key. The key goes into a recycle bin, and then in order to really get rid of it, you have to do a hard delete or a second delete. So that's now not optional anymore, that's mandatory. So there are three options for this delete. There's the purgeable option, which is the default, namely when you delete, you do the soft delete, and then you have to do the purge afterwards. But you have control over that as well. You can actually click it up a notch and say, I want to make it non-purgeable, meaning you can't actually purge that key. Or you can do, say, a do not cancel. That's the strongest option, which actually allows anyone from deleting the subscription outright and getting rid of all the resources in there. So this is one level of protection we built in. The other level of protection, this is again more guidance, is we urge you when you use GODR, for example, to make sure that you have multiple key vaults in place so that in the case of a failover and on the unlikely event that the key vault in the original region is unavailable, your databases are still available. So good practice is if you use GODR and you move your data into another region, create a second key vault there as well. There's a whole set of guidelines that my colleague Alice wrote up that basically show you the best practice for configuring TDE. I think it's good reading if you're interested in using as production. Everything else is pretty much straightforward, so let me show you just quickly what we can do here. So back to the portal. Okay, so I'm going to my server. So TDE is a server-level capability, meaning that the key management has to be done at the server level at this point, although the individual protection, of course, is by database. So, so here we are. So if I go to transparent data encryption here, you will see that the use your own key is turned off. And so what you could do is we can say, let's turn this on. And then there's a couple steps you need to do. And so the first step is you need to have a key vault ready where your keys go. And in this case, as I said, if you create a new key vault here, we actually disabled that because we want you to make sure that we want to make sure you use soft delete. So if you use the portal, the only option you have is you use an existing key vault. Tomorrow in the workshop, I show you how you actually create a key vault from scratch. So here we can just basically, there's a whole list here. We can just go and pick one here. Here's my key vault. And now that we have a key vault, we can now either pick a key or we can create a new key. The news here is we now support two types of keys. We support the RSA type encryption, and we also support elliptic curve crypto. So you can choose the type of key, you can choose the length of the key, and don't set these here. That's, again, good practice is to not set an expiration date, because if you do, you forget about it, all of a sudden your key stops working, your database is unavailable. So, so let me pick this key here. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. So, so here's my key, make that the default. And then I'll save it. And there's a whole lot of warnings here, so make sure you heed the warnings, treat that key with care, back it up, and things like this. So now that we've turned on TDE with user-managed key here, if we now go and look at our database, for example, our Adventureworks database, and here we see data is encrypted. Encryption, by the way, is by default. I forgot to mention that earlier, but it's service-managed key. Now we have user-managed key. I'm in control of the key, and it works for the entire server there. OK, that is pretty much it for TDE. So my colleague is coming up now. Let me see if do you need to warm anything up here? Are you good to go?
Maybe a little bit.
So here's some additional information. I think this is good reading. And we'll stay with encryption now. We'll talk a little bit about Always Encrypted. Always Encrypted is our flagship encryption feature. And Jakob is going to talk to you a little bit about some advancements we've made there. If you're familiar with the first version, yep. I think you'll really like what Jakob has to say. So
right. So a few of you raised hands when Joachim asked who is using Always Encrypted, but to bring everybody on the same page. So this is the feature we released in 2016. It's a client-side encryption technology. So what it does, it encrypts data before on the client side. The client driver does it transparently inside the client application. Before the data is sent to the database, right? And then the driver inside the client application transparently decrypts the data retrieved from the database. So what it means is that SQL Server instance, the database system, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud, never has access to that data that is protected with this feature in plain text. And it doesn't have access to the keys protecting, encrypting the data either. What this implies is that you can pretty much put this database in an untrusted environment, if you will, or in other words, you have more control over the data now because you are not exposing the data in plain text in the database system. Therefore, the data is protected from some high-privileged users of the database environment, such as potentially malicious insiders, database administrators, machine admins, or cloud administrators, right? So even if you host your database in the cloud, if for any reason cloud is infected with malware or your data center on premise is infected with malware, that malicious code will not be able to access the data in memory of your SQL Server process because the data is encrypted. That's what we call encryption of data in use, or protecting confidentiality of data in use, right? Now, the problem is that client-side encryption typically comes with some fairly unpleasant side effects, right? So in the case of a database system, what we just said means that the SQL Server, the database system, doesn't have access to the data in plain text, right? So it's a great security, but the problem is that the database engine cannot really perform computations on the data, cannot reason about the data, cannot process queries that the applications submit to it, right? So this is the main challenge, the main problem that this entire feature is really focused about. The main value proposition of this feature is a solution to this hard problem of how to provide what we call confidential computing capabilities in the database environment, right? So how to enable SQL Server to perform computations on your data without revealing this data to potential malicious attackers that can infiltrate your database environment, right? So in the initial version of this feature, again released almost 2 years ago, we made a little step, a small step towards solving this problem. Namely, we implemented the deterministic encryption algorithm, which provided an ability, SQL Server with an ability to perform equality comparison on columns or data that is encrypted without knowing the plain text values and revealing these plain text values in the database environment, right? But of course, this is not sufficient in many customer scenarios for many applications. For example, if you want to do some pattern matching on the data that is encrypted with the current version of Always Encrypted and with most, or if not all, other third-party client-side solutions, you have to download all this software to the client, all this data to the client side and perform computations there, right? So the way we're trying to solve this problem now, or to provide more capabilities in terms of operations that you can perform on encrypted data, is by leveraging technology that is called secure enclaves. How many of you heard this term before? An enclave or a T, trusted execution environment? Okay, I see a few hands. So an enclave is a protected region of memory, right, which is contained in a hosting process. So in our case, a SQL Server contains an enclave, a protected region of memory that appears as a black box to that hosting process. So SQL Server cannot access the inside of the enclave. It cannot see the data or the code inside the enclave, right? And the same applies to all other processes and even the operating system, the kernel of the operating system. Nothing on this machine that contains the enclave can access the memory of the enclave, right? So how does it help us in providing these rich confidential computing capabilities that we aim here with this feature? So what we have done, we have basically refactored the SQL Server process so that it delegates certain computations on encrypted data to the enclave. And now this data, so before, in the current version of the feature, the data is never ever decrypted inside the SQL Server process, right? Now, with this enhancement, the data is decrypted inside the enclave, right? But remember, the enclave appears as a black box to the rest of the machine. Therefore, it is okay and it is safe to decrypt the data there, right? And now the code running inside the enclave, which is a small portion of the SQL Server code base, responsible for evaluating certain expressions in SQL queries, can perform rich computations on the data because now it has access to the plain text, right? But remember, we're doing this in such a way that this data, although it's decrypted, its plain text inside the enclave, it's not revealed to potential attackers in this database environment, right? So this allows us to provide richer computations on sensitive data without revealing data in plain text. We're starting with support for pattern matching like predicates and comparison operators, but this architecture essentially will enable us to support more operations in the future, right? So the idea is that we will deliver these rich confidential computing capabilities through this technology. There is one other problem. Some of you, again, raised hands when asked if you use Always Encrypted. You probably, those of you who are using Always Encrypted, you're certainly familiar with tools like Always Encrypted Wizard, or there are some equivalents in PowerShell. So basically, today, this feature requires the use of special tools if you want to encrypt existing data that is not encrypted yet, or if you want to perform operations like key management, key rotation, which require data to be re-encrypted. Today, you need to use special tools that download all the data to a trusted machine where the data is either encrypted or re-encrypted, right? With this technology, with Enclaves, we will be able to do this operation in place, right? Again, inside the enclave without moving the data outside of the SQL Server, all right? So let me show you a quick demo. Again, this will be a quick teaser of what you will be able to see tomorrow. You'll be able to see tomorrow a longer version of it if you join us in the workshop. So what I have here, let me start with SQL Server Management Studio. I have a database with a very simple schema, just one table. So let's see what this table contains. It contains, as you can see by the names of the columns, fairly sensitive data about employees, social security numbers, and also date of birth. Now, I already enable Always Encrypted on this table on these two columns. The data here is encrypted, right? So if a malicious insider, a DBA, tries to retrieve the data, all they can see is ciphertext, which is what you see now. Or if I attach a debugger to the SQL Server process trying to exfiltrate this sensitive data from memory, again, all I can get is ciphertext. Again, Always Encrypted is already enabled on these two columns. Now, we also have a simple web application here, okay? And you can see the difference is that the application has access to the data in plain text because it has been configured in such a way that it has access to the keys that protect the data. And the client driver in this application has been configured in such a way that it transparently decrypts the data that are retrieved from encrypted columns. So the application has access to the plaintext data, potential high privilege but unauthorized users of the database system, they only can see the ciphertext, right? So that's what you see so far is pretty much possible, achievable with the current version of Always Encrypted. Now, what is not possible today, and what we are enabling here, are richer computations on encrypted data. So as you can see here, this application has a relatively rich UI. I can filter these employees by salary. I can also enter a substring, a portion of the social security number, so that I can filter these employees, right? Now, we have a extended event session open in the management studio. So whenever I use this UI, this application fires a SQL query against the database. So let's see how these queries look like, okay? So let's magnify this. So as you can see, let's look at the query statement itself first, right? So this query statement is a select statement, and it contains, first of all, the like predicate on the SSN column, right? And it contains the greater than, less than operators against the salary column. Again, both these columns are encrypted, right? The second detail to note is that, so you saw in the UI, the filtering criteria, the salary range, the social security pattern, substring of the portion of the social security number, they appear in plaintext, right? But here, this is what the SQL Server gets. It gets the encrypted values of these search criteria. So what happens, the client driver inside the client application transparently encrypts these search criteria, right? So the SQL Server gets encrypted values. And what happens next, it sends these search criteria and the values stored in these columns to the enclave that decrypts this data, and having access to plaintext can perform rich computations such as those included pattern matching and comparison operators, which are included in this query, right? So what you get with this, you get strong security, ability to protect data from high privileged unauthorized users without unpleasant consequences and compromises. So you preserve the ability of the database engine to perform rich computations of this data, right? So switching back to the deck, one thing I want to show you is we have a few resources, including the video with a more extensive demo. But one thing I'd like to encourage you to do is, if you think you have a use case for this enhanced version or capability, a set of capabilities in Always Encrypted, we have an early access preview program open. If you want to learn more about our roadmap and what's coming next, you can go to this page and sign up. Thank you.
Very good, Jakob. This is cool. So no more.
Thanks.
So I can get in-place encryption now. I don't have to worry about the round
That's
trip
right.
anymore.
So I guess the short summary is you have a lot of things in place. You don't have to move your data outside of the database to perform rich computations and cryptographic operations. Yep. Everything is done inside where it should be done, I guess, right?
And I think one last thing to note is that this is all part of the what we call Azure Confidential Computing Initiative. So actually happy to say that this feature here that Jakob's team is working on is, I think, one of the first instantiations of this confidential computing project. So this is great. Good to hear this. I think we're almost done. Let me just show this last slide, and then we'll open it up for questions. Actually, we have a good solid 5 minutes, which is wonderful. Security by default. So this is these are some pillars here of sort of principles that we take to heart and that we use in order to craft our roadmap. I was at RSA recently, and security by default was an important topic there. And there's a shift in the industry now where it used to be, well, this breach happened because the user used a bad password or they forgot this and they forgot that. Well, that's not the case anymore. Now when there's a breach, we really, the actual vendor, the software writers, the people who own the hardware, the onus is on them to make sure the stuff that they provide is secure. So we can't offload this to users anymore. So we're taking this to heart too. We have a bunch of plans in the works where we want to make SQL more secure by default. So this is an important pillar for us. Easy to use and intelligent security. Again, this is one of those areas that we're investing heavily now. So this whole area of advanced threat protection is sort of a foray in that area with the SQL threat protection feature that we have that attempts to monitor, or that monitors the database and then attempts to find unusual events. Vulnerability assessment, classification, all of these features are going in this direction of doing things proactively, learning by observing and from past experiences. So this is something that we are investing in. The scalability is something that I don't think we actually have to put it here. This is something that we are doing, like be it VA at scale or doing classification at scale or TDE or anything that has to SQL. We had an earlier session, we said SQL scales, our features have to scale as well. The consistency across our family, including managed instance, is another area where this is actually something we haven't done quite so well, and we're looking at this again to make sure that when there's a feature that comes out, we don't have a big matrix saying, well, it works here, but it doesn't work in this version, and it's not there, but here. So for example, DW is an area where we're actively trying to close some of the gaps that we have in terms of security. And then the trusted cloud, this goes towards ensuring that we have adequate security, internal security, to make sure that the data that you entrust in us is safe and secure and private, stays private. We have a lot of compliances. We do certifications all the time. So this is another one of those areas that continuously gets funding. So with this, I'll stop here and I'll invite you guys for some questions that you have. And then, like I said, we have a workshop tomorrow where we go into a lot more detail on all the features we talked about here today. So I'll invite my two co-presenters back up here if you want, and I'll open it up for questions. If there are any. Yes?
Are there any possibilities where we assign multiple labels to a certain column or certain type of data?
So
I saw confidentiality, GDPR, sometimes they overlap.
yeah, so the question is it possible, or in the future, will you support multiple labels being attached to an object? Because there may be some overlap. I think the answer is yes. I don't know what the roadmap here is, but there's a lot more work coming in terms of the label hierarchies, and so we're expanding. We're looking into that. I don't have an answer for when that might arrive, but I can get you in touch with the right folks to make sure that that's something that we're looking at. But I've seen these use cases. We do internally go and do GDPR readiness for Microsoft for SQL as well, and we have run into exactly those use cases as well. And so we have internally ways to do this, but yeah, I think this is something that will have to show up.
So, Azure, on the unstructured data side, you have Azure Information Protection, AIP,
Mm-hmm.
and you manage labels through their classification. You use your own functionality.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have a centralized console where you can do information protection in general for your organization, that way you're not going to different consoles or portals to manage?
Yes, so just let me repeat. The question is, I know of Azure Information Protection, or actually it's called Microsoft Information Protection, MIP now. Will there be a place, or will you work on something, a dashboard, where I can do my label, my classification, manage my labels wholesale rather than having to go to each individual service? And the answer is yes, it's going to be the Azure Security Center. I think this is where this will land, and you'll see a lot more than just a dashboard. You'll see the ability to actually create policies there that will now act on the protection that or that defined protection based on the labeling that is done in these individual services.
Structured data also. 'Cause I know Azure is from unstructured. It'll all be, the idea is eventually have it all managed Microsoft information protection. This information protection is all basically going to have one Uber management where.
And this, yes, it'll be for different services, not just for SQL, but also for Cosmos DB and some of these other services as well. Yes?
Yes, so I guess we have a use case, it's for the on-prem SQL Server. So we have a use case about the segregation of the duties. So we have actually people work for us. They're not actually our employees, they're like offshore people. So we like to protect the data, but they're actually sort of like administrators, right? So we don't really want them to see the data. So is that the later feature, like providing will be something like this solution to help with that? So because I think we have a concern is that if they see the data, they can potentially export the data, I guess, to other places. So at the same time, there are sort of like administrator, right? We actually want them to have the access to the database. So it will be I guess, a solution
Sure.
potentially for that. And this is actually on-prem. So at this point, we don't have a plan to move them, at least cannot move them to the cloud yet. So maybe some of the features that we cannot use, at least from Azure.
So let me rephrase the question quickly. So you have a concern that, and this is for on-prem, that you want to make sure that you have finer grain sort of protection mechanisms for your users so that you can create and you can manage permissions in such a way that some users can see some data, but not everything. They can do certain actions. So this goes towards separation of duties, I think. And what I didn't quite catch is, are you looking to move to the cloud and you are satisfied with on-prem but not the cloud, or you not?
I think we're planning maybe in the future, but I think our cloud migration is not there yet. This is probably going to run on the IaaS environment, which is probably not there yet. So I think there's a plan, but at a certain time, I think the project team is looking at a solution at this point for the on-prem. So,
That whole idea of a holistic protection platform,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
right, where it applies, the parameters and prepare the data on-prem prior to being moved into the cloud. So, but there's that whole segregation of duties.
Yeah.
Everybody, they can be DBA or SQL Server admins, but you don't want them to actually access the information to take this.
So I think there's a longer answer possibly in store here, but to sort of make it short from my end, and we can take it offline too. We have some gaps in sort of how do permissions are assigned and how we control permissions both on-prem and in the cloud. I'm not sure we'll be addressing that immediately. We are aware of it. We're looking at some options. And there are existing capabilities that could be used, and I don't know how much you already are taking advantage of this. So I think the short answer is there's nothing immediately coming that potentially addresses your problem, but we may have some mitigations for you that might work or may not. So that might be better to have this as a longer discussion. Or Jakob, maybe you can add something there.
Yeah, so you can basically solve this problem in theory, in general, through the permission model, which we have some gaps in, and we, as Joachim mentioned, we are thinking about addressing them. So that's not quite possible today. Or you can solve it through encryption, and always encrypted is one possibility. Again, this requires more thought and more analysis, whether it fits and meets your requirements. But we do see customers using always encrypted exactly for the purpose you describe, sharing the data with the untrusted party. Or if if you can create a copy of the data rather than sharing the production data, then this opens an avenue for some kind of a static masking or data masking solution, and here Redgate or us in the future can help as well.
We do actually. We see training in classroom use cases as well, actually,
Right.
for our DevOps provisioning. It's being able to stand up lots of copies that have been masked is, for I don't know your exact scenario, but for training classroom scenarios, that sometimes works.
Yep. So yeah, we'll be happy to talk to you offline. Anything else for today?
I think
Good, then we'll close the session. Thanks for your attention, and hope to see as many of you as possible at tomorrow's workshop. All right, thank you.
thank you.